You fool! Warren is dead.
Welcome to HorrorBabble. I'm back today with a new original, the contents of Deposit Box 327. This one tells of the trials and tribulations of a down-and-out chap by the name of Mick Barnes, who recruits a similarly afflicted friend to help solve a family mystery. I hope you enjoy it, folks. The contents of Deposit Box 327 by Ian Gordon. 1. Mick Barnes knew I was skint. Knew it because I was constantly skint. Live hand to mouth, month in, month out. Payday was never just around the corner. Always weeks away, promising little reprieve from the ridiculous outgoings that served as punishment for my apparently short-sighted decision to join the rat race. Mick's situation wasn't dissimilar. He'd been out of work for quite a stretch, impeded by a missing foot, the result of an industrial accident some years earlier. The incident had forced him to quit his rental in the city and to seek the aid of his elderly father, Joe, a man whose own infirmities served only to exacerbate Mick's predicament. Joe Barnes was as poor as they come, with neither penny nor possession to his name, and the poky council flat he dared call his home was going straight back to the local authority the moment his appointment with the undertaker came to pass. But what else could my old mate do? Hard times call for tough measures. An opportunity for redemption was soon to come his way, though. I said Mick's father hadn't a possession to his name, but this isn't strictly true. It turned out he kept a photo album, a tatty green thing that seemed to materialise out of thin air during the final hours of his miserable life. The album contained a remarkably dated photograph, showing a couple of unusual-looking characters standing next to a stuffed lion, the striped canvas of a circus tent in the background. With the picture clutched in a gnarled hand, Joe told a mightily strange tale, before succumbing to the natural causes later declared by the medical examiner. Mick summoned me the very next day. "That's me great-grandpa on the left," he said, showing me the picture. "Not a clue who the other guy is, but look at the lion, its mouth specifically." I brought the faded image closer to my tired eyes and squinted like a 90-year-old. It seemed to me that the great cat had a gemstone or something in its mouth. "The lion was called Crimson," Mick went on. "My great-grandpa and his cohorts brought it back to England from Tanzania at the turn of the century. According to my dad, the ruby in its mouth was a plaything. It was chewing on it when they found it." My eyes wandered from the lion's gob to the nasty-looking leather whip the man on the left was clutching. "What was he?" I asked, referring to Mick's great-grandpa. "A lion tamer?" "Among other things. Acrobat, clown, contortionist, fire-breather, tightrope walker, you name it." "Huh," I mumbled absently, glancing at the ruby again. It was massive, that thing. And even in the sepia tones of that faded photograph, it seemed to sparkle with a mysterious fire. "So," Mick said, "what do you think?" "About what?" "About tracking that thing down." "The lion?" "No, you idiot, the ruby." "Oh, right." I cleared my throat. "Well, I don't know. Where is it?" Mick sighed, rolling his eyes. "Come on, John. Do you really think I'd be asking you to help me track it down if I knew where it was?" "Right, yeah. Sorry." The truth is, I wasn't really listening. I was absorbed by the photograph. There was something unsettling about it, particularly that stuffed beast standing between the two men, something strange beyond my ability to comprehend. The whole image held a weird, lifelike quality, so that the lion appeared to me very much alive. And the solemn gaze of Mick's great-grandpa, the long-departed Richard Barnes, seemed to penetrate the lens of the camera, meeting my own. Was he pleading with me? I shuddered involuntarily. "Where do we begin?" I asked, managing to drag myself away from the photograph. "I haven't much to go on," Mick said. "My dad was already fading when he started with all this. Said that Crimson is still out there somewhere, probably with the circus." And then, in response to my raised eyebrows, "Yeah, it's still active." Glancing at the lion again, I said, "And you think it'll still be chewing on that ruby?" "No," Mick said, shaking his head firmly. "But my dad said there'd be some clue as to the stone's location on or in Crimson." "This is some weird shit," I muttered, stifling a chuckle. "Some weird shit worth investigating," Mick asserted, shaking the photograph. "That rock's at least 20 carats. Just look at it, it's the size of a fist. Gotta be worth a small fortune." "Can't argue with that," I said. After all, what did I know about the value of precious gemstones? So followed Mick's inevitable statement. "We're off to the circus, then." 2. The next morning, I found myself behind the wheel, en route to Lincolnshire. It was the height of summer, the middle of July, so naturally it was lashing it down. "Perfect day for it," Mick muttered, cursing the clouds overhead. From Glossop, we were taking the A57, known locally as Snake Pass, through the Peak District, which we'd follow past Sheffield and Worksop, continuing east towards Newton-on-Trent, just outside of Lincoln. From there we'd head north on the AUDIBLE, on the lookout for the telltale presence of a travelling circus, in this case the aptly named Crimson Circus. Mick had remained tight-lipped as to how he'd tracked it down, which didn't do much for my faith in him. Even if we managed to find that ruby, I doubted I'd ever get my hands on it. Mick had that look in his eyes, the look of one who means to succeed in his quest at any cost. I was essentially the driver of the getaway car, expendable. At least that's how I felt, on that drive through the rain, cresting the barren summit of Snake Pass. The rain had stopped as we crossed the county border into Lincolnshire. A good omen, I thought. We'd been on the road some 2 hours by then, and we were eager to stretch our legs. Reaching Newton-on-Trent, we immediately saw a large billboard advertising the Crimson Circus, detailing its approximate location off the A1133, just as Mick had said. 10 minutes later, having followed the aforementioned road without hindrance, we spotted a tall and colourful helter-skelter rising above the roadside shrubbery, prompting us to take the next turn-off. But as we arrived at the entrance to the circus, we saw that the place was deserted, which I thought was rather unusual, given that it was being advertised as an all-day attraction just down the road. A large gate, the kind you might see securing a farmer's field, was drawn closed and locked with 1,000,000 padlocks. Over the gate, beyond a sizable stretch of boggy countryside, stood the circus proper, a grey enclosure surrounded by sagging, colourless tents, the helter-skelter standing apart from the site on a patch of rough ground. "What now?" I said, killing the engine in front of the gate. "We hop over," Mick replied, unbuckling his seatbelt and exiting the vehicle. "Okay," I muttered under my breath, following suit. In a matter of seconds, we were up and over the gate and trudging through the mud, Mick seemingly oblivious of the mess he was making of his crutches, single shoe and trousers, myself wincing with every step I took. There was a smell in the air, a weird commingling of agricultural odours and carnival refreshments like toffee apples dipped in cowpats. Not an appetising whiff by any means. But Mick was undeterred, nor was he daunted by the curious group of figures that had appeared ahead of us, the bizarre assortment of characters, short and tall, wide and wiry, a regular motley crew of oddballs, watching our approach with keen interest. "Hello," Mick called, squelching through the bog. "It's me, Mick." Something in this announcement seemed to neutralise the strangers ahead of us. They swiftly departed, with the exception of one, a giant of a figure who seemed to look down at us even from a significant distance. Aglow in the fading light of the afternoon, this towering stranger awaited our arrival with the patience of a silver butch. "The last Barnes, as I live and breathe," stammered the figure, a bald fellow in a baggy top and trousers. Not the costume of a clown, I have to say, just regular clothes that were far too big for the man's frame. "The very same," Mick said, smiling broadly. The grin was returned, which I have to say was regrettable, because the fellow hadn't a single tooth in his gob. The mouth of Mother Shipton's cave opened up, in the shadowy depths of which swung a monstrous, unhealthy-looking uvula. "They're expecting you," I muttered to Mick, as slyly as I could manage. "How?" "It's 2013, John. You think they're using carrier pigeons?" "That's not really what I meant." But my sentence was cut short by the approach of the toothless giant, who it seemed was very, very pleased to meet Mick. He stepped forward and grabbed him like a parent embracing a toddler, squeezed him like a long-lost brother. "Nice to meet you too," he managed, the wind pumped from his lungs. "Been a while since we've had a Barnes around here," the tall man said, chewing on the words as they left his mouth. The giant ushered us into the enclosure proper, then into one of the drooping tents, where we were introduced to one of the things we were looking for, Crimson, the stuffed lion. But boy, if he was worse for wear. I mean, he looked pretty good for a corpse, but for a piece of taxidermy. He's bigger than he looks in the photograph," I said involuntarily. "Yeah, it just came out." "Photograph?" the toothless giant asked. "Here," Mick said, withdrawing the thing from his jacket pocket. The big man grabbed the proffered item and inspected it carefully. A look washed over his face, one of melancholy, I thought. "Ah," he said slowly, "Bobby John and Davy Rich, and look at you, Crim," he added, gesturing towards the ragged lion. "Just a tyke." It seemed to me that this lanky character, devoid of teeth but not looking a day over 45, gazed at the subjects in the photograph as if he had known them personally, like the faces of absent friends seen for the first time in a very long time. "Bobby John?" Mick asked. "Your great-grandfather," the big man said. "That's what they called him. Davy Rich was another old boy, also lost in the mists of time." Perhaps the big chap wasn't over 100 years old after all. "And what's your name?" I asked, sounding like a teacher trying to acquaint himself with a new pupil. "They call me Addy," he said, his cavernous mouth horrifying me all over again. "They've always called me Addy. Been Addy as long as I can remember." He's going on a bit, I thought. I caught Mick eyeing the stuffed lion. I could tell that he was trying to get a look in its mouth, a mouth that was open, but certainly didn't contain a precious gemstone the size of a fist. With Addy addressing me on the subject of his name, Mick went for Crimson's mouth and managed to get a hand inside. A bold move indeed. "No use looking in there," the big man said, startling Mick. "Went the way of Bobby John," he continued, casting his eyes towards the canvas ceiling. Mick shrugged his shoulders. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said, sidling away from the lion and stumbling on his crutches in the process. "Your great-grandfather took the stone," Addy stated. "Took it before Davy Rich could get his hands on it. The two of them, they both wanted it, fought over it. Neither believed the legends." "What legends?" I put in, realizing I was gradually being drawn into an episode of Tales of the Unexpected. "The legend of the Sky Stone," Addy answered, looking and sounding like a character from an episode of Tales of the Unexpected. "It belongs to the cat. Bobby was warned, so was Davy. The cat's yours, they said, but the stone goes with him. Separate the two and on your head be it." "Who are they?" Mick asked, rubbing his head in confusion. "Ah," said Addy, shaking his head. "There are many tribes in Tanzania, the Assa, the Chaga, the Bantu. But there are hidden tribes too, some of which pray to the Sky God. The Sky God, whose name we mustn't speak aloud, is a great cat, the protector of mortal cats, and, by association, certain tribes. Loyal tribes look after their cats and receive the sky god's blessings, abundance, vitality, wisdom. But if the rules of the sky god are broken, a blessing may become a curse. Mick stood stock still for several moments, deep in thought. So my great-grandpa took the stone and, was punished by this sky god? Naturally, said Ardy, nodding deeply. What about the other guy? I put in. Davy Rich had a part to play in the scheme, but his punishment was altogether the lesser. What do you mean by that? Mick asked. The big man smiled and stroked Crimson's matted head. A blessing may become a curse, he said, looking around at his surroundings, his hands seeking his dark mouth involuntarily. If you're determined to walk the same path, he continued, eyeing Mick seriously, then you might pay Carl Rugg a visit. Who's that? Mick asked. He's a young man, about your age, the great-grandson of Davy Rich. I think the two of you have a lot in common. But, Mick began, only to be shushed by the toothless giant. No more, said Ardy. It's been a pleasure, but Crim has given you more than enough of his time. Look for Rugg in Tealby. And it was with that rash dismissal that the lanky figure escorted us from the drooping tent and sent us on our way. Crossing the boggy field, Mick's crutches dipping into the earth like nails hammered into jelly, I felt the fiery gaze of the toothless giant burning a hole in the back of my head. Not once did I look back. As we were climbing into the car, our muddy trousers and shoes ruining the upholstery, Mick said, Where the hell's Tealby? 3. Fortunately, Tealby wasn't too far away. A 45-minute drive northeast, on the edge of the Lincolnshire Wolds. Arriving in the village and parking on the road across from the King's Head pub, Mick blurted, Now what? What, you haven't received instructions from your carrier pigeon yet? Mick wheezed out a chuckle. All right, he said, patting me on the shoulder. What about the pub? I suggested, feeling thirsty all of a sudden. Someone's bound to know where to find him in there. And so we clambered out of the car, still damp with mud, and approached the King's Head. Quite the looker too, having the outward appearance of a large thatched cottage, with tiny windows and whitewashed walls. Inside, we were met by a very enthusiastic barmaid, who was quick to see to our needs, serving us up a pint apiece, the black stuff on both counts. Nice place, I said, scanning the interior, nodding at the round and somewhat indifferent faces that looked back at me. Thanks, the woman said, smiling broadly, and I'm pleased to say that her mouth was in possession of teeth. Here for the weekend? She asked. Not sure, Mick put in. We're trying to track someone down, actually. Yeah? The barmaid said. A local? Carl Rugg, I answered. You heard of him? The woman nodded, saying, Aye, he's a regular, is Carl. What do you want with him? It's a long story, said Mick. Let's just say our families go back together. Ah, she murmured, frowning slightly. I know Carl, said a voice to our rear. We turned and saw the short, stocky frame of a man in his 50s, a white-haired chap with a poor complexion. A farmer, was my bet. Lives up the road, the man went on, pointing at the window as if that clarified the matter. He won't get his address out to me, but I'll give him a call for you if you want. That'd be great, I said. Cheers. Who shall I say is after him? An interesting way of phrasing the question, I thought. Tell him it's Michael Barnes, the great-grandson of Richard Barnes, Mick said. If that doesn't do the trick, well, tell him it's about Crimson. Give us a minute, the man said, excusing himself from the bar area. Stroke a luck there, Mick muttered, proceeding to down half of his pint in one long gulp. I followed suit. A few minutes later, the stocky fellow, whose name we would later learn was Terry, re-emerged from a shadowy corner. "Says he'd like to meet you," the man said. "Great," Mick replied, having another do at his pint. Long story short, Terry gave us the address, and before long we were inching our way up Church Lane in search of Carl Rugg's cottage. We found it without fuss, and were greeted on the threshold by a very ordinary-looking young man, a chap similar in age to Mick and me, with red hair and thick glasses. "Heard about the stone, eh?" he said in a thick, gravelly voice that belied the man's outward appearance. "Indeed," Mick said, approaching him and extending a hand to shake. Introductions and pleasantries aside, Carl invited the two of us into his home, and we were escorted to a dark dining room, sparsely furnished. We sat ourselves down, declining his offer of a drink, full to the brim with the black stuff, which, in my case at least, was still sitting at the very top of my stomach. "I've known about it for years," Carl said, returning to what he'd said outside. "Dad told me everything. It was supposed to put me off." "Put you off looking for it?" Mick asked. "Aye," he said, pouring himself a cup of lukewarm tea from a pot on the dining table. "What was it he told you?" I asked. Carl sighed, breathing deeply. "Told me that my great-granddad was a right rumman," he said. "Yours too," he added, looking at Mick. "Squabbled over everything apparently. Women, money, and obviously valuable items. Told me about the circus, the old circus, that is. How, during the travels, Bobby John and Davy Rich would regularly get themselves into trouble. Drinking, gambling, thieving. And although they were at loggerheads most of the time, they were apparently inseparable." "Huh," Mick muttered, a strange look washing over his face. "You haven't heard all this?" Carl asked. "No," Mick said. "My dad never said anything about anything. Kept everything to himself till he was on his deathbed." "My dad couldn't keep his mouth shut," Carl blurted. "As I said, it was meant to put me off." "What happened to him?" Mick asked plainly. "Our great-grandparents, I mean. I know Robert disappeared. That sort of thing is hard to hide, no matter how much you try to bury it." "Your dad told you that?" Carl asked. Mick shook his head. "Well, no, not exactly. It was just one of those things that seemed to crop up every now and then. You know, family gatherings, weddings, funerals, etc. Sounds like someone tried to put your dad off too. Your granddad, perhaps?" "Pops," Mick said, frowning. "Pops was just like my dad. Had nothing to say about nothing." "I wouldn't be too sure," Carl said, nursing the mug on the table in front of him. "What about your great-granddad?" Mick continued. "What happened to him?" "Oh, he lived to a ripe old age," Carl replied, smiling strangely. As I listened to this exchange, I gathered a pretty clear picture of the past. There were two mischievous men, members of a circus troupe, who got themselves into a spot of bother. As a result, one of them disappeared without a trace. The other, involved somehow but for some reason unwilling to admit his role in the affair, declared a pact of silence, choosing never to speak of it again. The obvious question was, why? What the hell happened to those two? "The guy at the circus, Ade," I said. "It was him who told us to seek you out. What's the script?" "I could ask you the same," Carl answered, adjusting his spectacles. "Are you after that stone?" Mick sighed heavily. "Yes," he admitted, shrugging his shoulders. "And why not? I'm a cripple, and I haven't got two beans to rub together. We're not all living in country cottages, mate. If there's a stone out there with the potential to improve my lot, I'm going to try to get my hands on it." "Fair enough," Carl said, which I have to say wasn't the answer I was expecting. "I'll tell you what I know, and the rest is up to you." The red-headed rug didn't know much, it turns out. Certainly not the particulars of what had transpired between the two bosom buddies all those years ago. But there was an address that he'd long resisted the urge to seek out, An address that Carl's father and his father before him had considered unworthy of their attention. This owing to the constant threat of the pervasive Sky God, a deity that all of them, Carl included, believed held sway over them. Davy Rich, a witness to Bobby John's fate, knew that to interfere with the plan of the Sky God would be to secure a similar fate for himself. This was the message, both spoken and unspoken, that had been passed down the Barnes and Rugg family lines for over a century. Mick, lacking the wisdom apparently required to fully appreciate the threat posed by the Sky God, simply laughed the whole thing off, chalking his great-grandpa's disappearance down to death by misadventure. In fact, he went so far as to accuse Carl's great-granddad David Rugg of being the cause of Richard Barnes's untimely end, inferring that the rather grandiose cottage in which Carl lived had more than likely been paid for with dividends generated by the long-lost Ruby. The whole thing got a little messy before the end, and it was up to me to talk Mick down, to remind him that there was an address to investigate, an address that might just lead him to his prize. But it was getting late in the day, and we were in need of a place to crash for the night. It absolutely wasn't going to be under the roof of Carl Rugg. So we left the red-headed man's attractive abode and returned to the welcoming warmth of the King's Head, where, as luck would have it, we managed to book a couple of rooms for the night. What a day! 4. Over breakfast the following morning, a proper full English courtesy of the King's Head, Mick and me hashed the whole thing out. Something weird was going on. Had been going on for a long time. A very unusual set of circumstances involving the unscrupulous activities of a couple of circus performers, who, deliberately or not, had set into motion a series of events that were to affect not only their lives, but the lives of those connected to them. As far as I was concerned, we were heading closer and closer towards the jaws of doom. But Mick, ever the optimist, in spite of 30-odd years of toil and misfortune, was determined to open those jaws and snatch something of value before they closed on top of him. So, once again, we pulled the Ordnance Survey out and located the address Rugg had given us on the map. This time we would leave Lincolnshire and head north to the East Riding of Yorkshire. The small market town of Beverley was our target, an address at the very centre of town, 127 Lairgate. From Tealby, we managed the drive in just over an hour, despite a slight build-up of traffic on the Humber Bridge. We found parking easily enough and threaded our way towards the address in question, navigating the narrow streets and market squares with little effort. And there it was at last, a large Georgian affair, apparently unnumbered, standing at the very end of Lairgate, where the street meets Keldgate. "Is this it?" I asked without confidence, as the building appeared to be derelict. "It must be," Mick said, scratching his head. "But what is it? A bank?" Well, it looked like it might once have been a bank, as, in addition to the bold facade, which looked pretty secure, a night safe was embedded in the front wall. A long-disused night safe, I might add. "How do we get in?" Mick continued, far too eager to wait for an answer to his previous question. "I'm not sure we can," I said, noting that the windows were covered with thick metal sheets, not to mention the fact that the front of the building was completely exposed to passing vehicles and foot traffic. Regardless, I wasn't sure I wanted to get in. The whole idea made me queasy, as if we were on the cusp of some horrible revelation, a terrible truth we wouldn't soon recover from, if ever. But Mick, the big idiot, was undeterred. He limped his way around the back of the building, and somehow was able to jimmy open the tarnished iron gate he found there. I followed swiftly, keeping an eye on my back, as we weren't the only pedestrians out and about that morning. The back of the property wasn't quite as striking as the front, being essentially a cheap-looking breeze block extension, and instead of metal sheets covering the windows, Sorry-looking wooden boards had been roughly nailed into place, some of them hanging loose in compromising positions. With a quick look to his left and right, Mick went for the first board he came across and yanked at it like a man possessed. Reluctantly, I joined him, and with very little effort we dislodged it, the nails popping out like safety pins from a corkboard. "Eureka!" Mick said, though why he said it I haven't a clue. Didn't seem to align itself with an act of breaking and entering. I gave him a leg up, and through the exposed hole he went, landing on the other side with a thud. I climbed up after him, eager to be out of the view of the surrounding buildings, where I was absolutely convinced various people were milling about, office workers and apartment dwellers. Exploring the old bank, it was immediately evident that the owners of the building were still paying the electricity bill, as Mick had started flicking switches, resulting in a flood of artificial light. We went through a succession of empty rooms, connected by stark corridors, and as we moved deeper and deeper into the building, discovering more of the same, our confidence in the success of our search began to dwindle. "Where are we going?" I said, not really expecting an answer. "Haven't a clue," Mick replied, exceeding my expectations. And I say this because he'd all but forgotten about my presence as we made our way into the bowels of that dilapidated building. He was caught up in the search, lusting after the prize that had grown to consume his every thought over less than 48 hours. He was sweating profusely, as was I. The place was scorching. A blanket of grey clouds might have hidden the sun, but it had done nothing to reduce the oppressive heat that went with it. But on we went, turning a blind eye to our discomfort. I think we both knew that something was waiting for us down there, something that Mick and Carl Rugg's families had ignored for decades. Mick was certain it was crimson stone, that fist-sized ruby of immense value, but I wasn't so sure. I didn't like the smell of it. There was a very good reason Davy Richard warned people off this place, and I was genuinely afraid to learn what that reason was. Before long, having descended at least 2 flights of stairs, we entered a long, foreboding passageway, at the end of which stood a large door, a vast metal door, which could only be the door to a vault of some description. And what's more, the door was ajar. The look on Mick's face as he realized this was one of pure exultation. It was like a starved dog come face to face with a wedge of raw meat. And off he went, forgetting me completely. With both hands he shoved the heavy door open and stepped into the vault proper, dimly lit as it was by the light from the passageway. Tentatively, I followed. Inside were dozens of shelving units, all empty. No gold bullion, no bags of cash conveniently overlooked. Can you imagine? But on the far wall, visible now as our eyes adjusted to the low light, was a large bank of safe deposit boxes. These were numbered 1 to 500, of varying sizes, and filled the entirety of the wall. They looked like they'd been there forever. Seeing this, Mick seemed to remember he had company, and turned to face me, grinning like a madman. "What now?" I asked, eyeballing the interminable rows and columns ahead of us. Then Mick surprised me. In fact, he shocked me. Like a man in receipt of divine intervention, he limped towards the boxes and muttered, 327. Then he produced a small key. I wanted to ask where on earth he'd got it, but my natural curiosity got the better of me. In the moment, I was much more interested to know what it was that we were about to find in safe deposit box 327. I joined Mick as he inserted the key, and after a few moments of fumbling and idle whistling, unlocked the box. "Thanks, Crim," he mumbled, and as he said the lion's name, I recalled the moment he'd reached into its mouth in search of what I thought at the time was the ruby. Externally, box 327 was a perfect square, roughly 30 by 30 centimetres. A bit on the large size for a fist-sized ruby, I thought, But then again, that might indicate the presence of other goodies too, other valuables stolen by the mischievous duo so many moons ago. But when Mick opened the hatch and began to pull the container out, I couldn't help but visualize those nasty-looking cabinets one finds in a morgue, those refrigerated drawers designed to temporarily house dead bodies. But this drawer was much smaller than a mortuary cabinet, and as it slid out, a rectangular box was revealed, a metal container some 60 centimeters in length. The box was old for sure. There was rust around the edges, due to decades of moisture probably, and it was jagged in places, requiring great care when handled. "I have a bad feeling about this," I stammered, doing my best to get Mick's attention. And at last it seemed to me that a shadow of doubt had fallen over his face. The whole thing was wrong somehow. I can't tell you why I felt that way. I just did. "What, you'd rather not know what's inside?" Mick managed, a tremor in his voice. I just shook my head involuntarily. I didn't know what to say. Mick took a deep breath, like a man gasping for air. He was hesitant, but he was also plagued by life struggles, desperate for a way out. The idea of there being a 20-carat jewel within his grasp was just too tantalizing to resist. And suddenly he barked, "I have to have it!" And off came the lid, rust flakes and all. 5. It's hard to describe what happened next. I mean, I can do it. I just don't really want to. But we've come this far, haven't we? At first, when the lid came off, I wasn't sure what I was looking at. It certainly wasn't a fist-sized ruby. The smell hit me first, a stench that registered as a sort of meaty pung, like the smell of beef and onion pie sitting in the window of a bakery. And then my visual cortex took over, working feverishly to interpret the strange images captured by my retinas. The thing in the box was a fleshy something, like a folded towel made of human skin. The flesh was hairy in places and dotted with freckles here and there. It was moist, too, sweaty, perhaps. It was foul. And then the groaning began. It was a low, muted moan, sounding from a flattened larynx, the disturbing whimper of one who has suffered far beyond the limits of human experience. "What?" Mick mouthed, more breath than voice. I stood there, frozen, dumbfounded, trying to work the thing out. The full extent of the horror before me hadn't registered. And then it moved. The thing quivered, and from somewhere below came another awful, faint groan. Mick, possessed by motivations foreign to him, reached into the container and clutched wildly at the thing. In doing so, he caught hold of some of the hair atop the surface and yanked it firmly. Up came a squashed face with disc-like bright eyes that stared at us pleadingly. Those eyes, I'd seen them before. "Bobby John?" Mick managed, staring in pure terror at the twisted shape in the box. And though the mouth moved, a mouth utterly devoid of teeth, just like the circus giant Ade, no further sounds were elicited. Was Robert Barnes still alive? Or was this some sort of trick? The kind of trick he and his circus troupe probably performed back in the day. After all, he'd been a contortionist, a flexible figure undoubtedly capable of squeezing himself into small compartments. But this was beyond contortionism. The mass of flesh below us was simply that. Flesh. There wasn't a bone in the man's body. Was this the blessing turned curse that the toothless giant had spoken of? A gift of longevity, perhaps, turned on its head as a punishment for greed? If that was the case, then what had become of Crimson's ruby? The questions kept on coming, but I decided against voicing them aloud. As if this terrible demonstration of unimaginable cruelty was anything to go by, it was better not to anger the sky god. whatever that thing truly was. Mick was silent. He was breathing heavily. Sweat dripped from his brow. Tears filled his eyes. We can't leave him like this, he said. And I understood. That folded mound of skin was his great-grandpa, a man who had spent over a century trapped inside a metal box. The thought appalled me. And yet there he was, evidence of such a fate, looking up at me with bright grey eyes like two 10-pence pieces. "Get out of here," Mick commanded, and I would have refused, if the look on both his face and the squash face of Robert Barnes hadn't convinced me that I had no business being there in the first place. I left the vault, exited the deserted bank as quickly as my legs could carry me. Eventually, Mick emerged from the building and limped towards me. I didn't ask what had happened. Couldn't ask. Part of me wanted to know, but a much greater part of me wanted to wash my hands of the whole thing, never to speak of it again. Which, I imagine, is just how Davy Rich felt when he saw what had become of his friend. I haven't seen Michael Barnes in a very long time, but I reckon there's some truth to the rumour that he joined the circus. The Crimson Circus, no less. Perhaps that was the only thing he could do. After all, the thing I saw bulging in his jacket pocket after emerging from 127 Lairgate would have to be returned to its rightful owner, if he was to avoid spending a century or more in the quiet discomfort of Safe Deposit Box 327.
If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,